Okay, now let's see how to do this in PyTorch. And in PyTorch, we'll actually be able to do the what's known as backpropagation, or the gradient descent on the parameters of multiple layers in a neural network. So in AI, we'll dive in a little bit more to how to do that mathematically. It's really not that bad, but for now, we're just going to let PyTorch do the gradient descent for us. So let's try to replicate something like what we had in just pure NumPy a moment ago. So I'm going to start with the code that I had for logistic regression. I'm going to tweak the data set a little bit so I have one blob inside of another one. So rather than doing this whole thing with the offset, what I'm going to do is instead pass along a radius that I'm going to say the negative class is inside of. So the negative, or the class with 0, is inside of this radius. And everything else is outside of it. So I'll say sub to r is equal to r. And then I'll go in here and I will generate a random position as my input. And actually now the output is going to be determined by the radius. So I'll say, okay, this radius is equal to square root of sum of x squared. Let's say if the radius is less than self.r, then my output y, so I'll say, okay, y is 1, we'll say it's the positive class, unless I'm inside of this radius. So I'll say y equals 0 in that case, and then otherwise it's the same. So let's see if those changes that I made to the data set here that I'm calling blobs, let's see if that shows up any differently here. Whoops, okay, offset is no longer a thing, now I'm going to pass along the radius, so I'll say r equals 1. And looking at this, looks good. Now, actually, I made this a little bit harder than I did back in the example that we had because I had a little gap in between the inner class and the outer class. But now they're right up against each other. Okay. This is all going to be kind of the same. So I'm showing you, the way that we pass this to a data loader. Actually, we should be a little bit careful. Now, so we're generating examples randomly here. When we go to actually load data, we should make sure that we have roughly the same number of samples per each class. So we want actually roughly the same number of negative examples as positive examples. Now let me think. So for the Gaussian, that's not exactly going to be true. It's going to be a little bit imbalanced here if I cut it off at a radius of 1, but it would be like 60-40 roughly. So it's just something to be mindful of. See, this batch had mostly negative examples here. So anyway, okay, but let's continue. So first, I'll just do what I did before and try to get this to work with logistic regression. So I'm just going to have a single perceptron that goes from 2 dimensions down to 1. And actually, it seems like I'm still getting a pretty good accuracy here, which is surprising. But again, that's because my class labels are not well balanced here. So I should be making sure, I don't have enough examples inside of, or outside of the circle actually. So I found it was best to say that everything was inside. So hey, I wasn't planning on talking about this, but yes, important lesson to make sure that we sample evenly here. So maybe what I'll do instead, let me think for a second how I'm going to balance these classes. Okay, so for this exercise, I just decided to change the way that I was sampling things. So I'm actually going to sample them in polar coordinates. So what I'll do is I'll make sure that the radius is uniformly distributed. And also that the angles are uniformly distributed within each radius. So now I have data that looks more like this. So it's not actually uniformly sampled. As I get further away from the origin, the points are a little bit further apart. So we have this distortion. Those who have multivariable calculus will recognize that's related to the Jacobian of the map from polar to rectangular. But whatever. Okay, but at least I think I should be evenly divided now. So yeah, when I take a random mini batch there, I see a better separation. So let's try to train this again, and this time we shouldn't see as good results. Yeah, so see, we kind of jump around a little bit, but at the end we still only have about 50% accuracy. So if I look at what I learned, the best it can really do is divide it down the middle. So how can we do better than this? Well, of course, we just learned that if we have multiple layers of these, then we can do better. So let's make a few layers. So I'm not just going to call this perceptron anymore. What I'm going to do is, okay, maybe I'll make my first layer. Let's say my first layer has So it starts, with all the positrons have an input of 2. So we would say, if we were thinking about the matrices we just set up, the matrix would have 2 rows. And it should be outputting, let's say that we use 3 perceptrons in the first layer. And then we're also going to, let's use a ReLU. Let's see, so it should be nn dash ReLU. Yep. So we're going to use a ReLU after that, right? And let's make another layer. Let's say that layer goes maybe from 3 inputs. So the outputs of these 3 neurons become the inputs of neurons in the next layer. So the first hidden layer. Let's say that maybe there's 4 perceptrons there. And then I'll have a ReLU after that. And then finally, I'll have my last layer here, which maybe we'll say that takes 4, the 4 inputs that came as outputs of this layer, and it'll just output one thing. And then what we'll do is this output we can feed to a sigmoid, I've called it a logistic function to be more specific in the past. So this output's not going to go through ReLU. It'll actually, the output here of layer 3 will go through a logistic function. But as I was saying before, okay, so if we use this logistic loss, then we don't explicitly encode going through that logistic function at the end there. So that's just one thing to be aware of. And I guess I better put these all in the device. So I'll do that real quick. Okay, so I've got all that. Now what I need to do is change the training loop a little bit here, because now I need to send the input through all these layers. So what I'll do is I'll say, okay, so the input, first it gets sent through layer 1, then that gets sent through the first ReLU, right? Is that what I called it? ReLU 1? Yeah. Okay, then that gets sent through layer 2, and it gets sent through the ReLU at the end of that. And then finally, it gets sent through the last layer. And that's actually like the output that we send to the logistic function, the logistic loss. Okay, now, one thing that I find helpful, alright, well let's first see if this runs. Okay, there's a problem. It's because, let's see, it doesn't recognize layer. I meant to say layer 3 on X. There we go. Okay, so this is running. Let's see if it actually trained. Because it didn't train here. We didn't get up to good accuracy. So we'll have to mess around with this a little bit. Before I do that though, I want to do something as a sanity check here. I find it helpful to print out the shape of this as it's going through. So after the first layer, it's going to have a different shape. So the inputs are 2-dimensional, and the outputs of the first layer should have 3 numbers to them, right? Because there's 3 perceptrons. And then after that, it should have 4, and then finally it should have 1. So I'll print out the shape after here. So I'll do that, and then I'll print it out here. And then finally it should have a shape of 1 actually. There's 1 output. Put a couple line breaks there so we can take a look. Okay, and so another thing to remember here is that actually we're doing mini batches. So we actually have, the input is actually 16 2-dimensional inputs, which then get each transformed into 16 3-dimensional inputs into the first hidden layer, and then we have the 4 in the second hidden layer, and then we go down to 1. So that looks good, but we got to figure out why is this thing not training. So whoops, I was making actually kind of a big mistake here. So I still had this variable in memory, perceptron, from before. I don't want to update that thing's parameters in the optimizer. I actually want to run gradient descent on this whole thing. And so it'll be a bit tedious actually to specify the parameters for each of these individually, and actually this is already kind of annoying down here to have to do that. There's a better way to do this. We can use a layer called a sequential layer. That's kind of like a meta layer. So I can say model is equal to nn.sequential, and then I'll pass in sequence all the layers that I want to be evaluated. So I'll say, okay, layer 1, then gets fed to a ReLU, then gets fed to layer 2, then gets fed to a ReLU, then gets fed to layer 3, and then that's the final output. So this is a way to wrap all these into one. And it's those parameters, all of those layers, that I want to update during gradient descent here. And then I want to make sure, okay, so I don't have to do all this anymore. What I can just say is ys is equal to model of the input x. And so, yeah, this is much better. When I say model, it's actually going to run through all of them now. And I also want to make sure that I change this down here. Okay, so let's see how this is doing. Good, so it's all running. And if I go to plot how this did, okay, it's training now. So I see a downward trajectory in the loss and an upward trajectory in the accuracy. So I'll let it go for a little bit longer, maybe let's say 200 epochs, and we'll see how it does. But yeah, this is the kind of trend that I want to see if it's actually training. So you want to check kind of in the middle to see. Usually it's going to take a lot longer. This is a pretty small example, but you'll check this in the middle and see, is it trending downwards? Otherwise, there's something wrong either with my architecture, you know, what I chose to have my layers be, or maybe there's another bug like the one I just had. Okay, but this looks good. So I get up actually pretty close to 100% accuracy in the end. Now, before I plot the results, I just want to look at the model a little bit. So if, you know, actually I'll just go up maybe closer to where I define the model and show you here. So, you know, this first layer, I just want to show you that it's set up exactly the same way that I set it up in my little notes here with the matrices, right? So if the input to a particular layer has, you know, 4 dimensions and the output has 5 dimensions, it's going to be a 5 by 4 matrix, right? And so here we've got the input has 2 dimensions and the output has 3 dimensions, so it should be a 3 by 2 matrix. So I can actually print out the parameters to that layer and see what they are. So yeah, this is the matrix that I've learned at the first layer. So again, two inputs, right? 2 dimensions because we're on the Cartesian plane, and then 3 outputs in the first layer. And just the same, if I print out layer 2 parameters, well, it's got 3 inputs, so 3 columns, and then 4 outputs. And also, actually, it's got these other parameters too, which are the biases, right? So it's got 4 outputs, which also means that it has 4 biases, right? That B term that we had on. So that's cool. We can see those there. And also, if you just print the model, there is a toString or a string function built into this in Torch where it prints information about what it is. So this is like a quick summary you can see of the model that we set up. So this is the function space that we're allowed to learn in. And that's what gradient descent is tweaking here, that it's learning. So I should say we're on the sequential model. Alright, so now what I'm going to do is actually look. So supposedly it's doing pretty well. Let's actually look at a similar visual to what I've done before. So here's what I would see if I sampled the output of this model on a grid. And hey, looks pretty darn good here. So the separator's not exactly where the white line is. It depends on the last perceptron, but yeah, this is looking pretty darn good. So I can definitely see that it learned some kind of a circle. Now it's not exactly a circle because I don't have probably enough neurons to do that. But look, that looks pretty good. Maybe let me update the number of neurons in the first layer here. So maybe I'll say, I don't know, let's put 100. Why not? We can really go hog wild with this now. And we'll see if we can get it to look any better than that. Any more like a circle. So I'm going to wait for a second. And then we'll see how's the progress here. Okay, looks similar, but maybe this is going to generalize better. Yeah, okay, so now it looks a lot more like a circle because I have more neurons. They're able to learn a finer boundary there. Nice. So very happy with that. Okay. So now I'm just going to have you do just a little question just to make sure that you're understanding how many parameters are in these things. And then we'll do more examples on class and on some actual music stuff. Okay, very good.